Australians have more than $3.3 trillion invested in superannuation. According to the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, APRA, we pay some $9.1 billion per annum in fees. But the Grattan Institute point out that many superannuation funds don't report the fees that they pay to companies who help to manage their members' investments. And when you add that all up, it puts the true costs significantly higher at around $30 billion per annum. That's $30 billion of Australians' money going to superannuation companies just in fees alone. I'm moving this motion to disallow because I believe we should know how that money, our money, superannuation members' money, is being spent. I'm moving this disallowance because I believe in more transparency, not less. I've listened to the arguments from both sides of this debate. I've heard the arguments from the government, unions and industry super funds that the regulation introduced by the former government are poorly drafted, create an unduly onerous compliance burden, and were ultimately created for use as a political weapon. I've heard the opposition's argument that some super funds are used as a vehicle for donations, but in less obvious ways than just via political donations, which the new regulations still require to be disclosed. Unions argue their presence and associated director fees on boards help ensure good outcomes for super fund members. Consumer bodies express concerns that the current government's wind-back of the previous government's measures go too far. They've said we need a greater level of transparency over how funds are spending their members' money. I think they're right, and the truth likely lies somewhere in between the two major parties' views on this issue. But it's certainly something that I've received a lot of correspondence from people in the ACT. People want to know where their super fund is spending their money. The government's public reasoning is that a requirement for a fully itemised list across all categories, marketing, sponsorships, directors' fees, would impose high compliance costs, ultimately borne by members. But funds are required to disclose this to APRA anyway, so I don't see how there's compliance costs if it's simply including the disclosure that you send to APRA to your members, who you're in charge, you're sort of looking after their money, investing on their behalf. They should actually know who those fees are going to. We also know after the government put through this regulation, allowing superannuation funds to put out their annual statements with aggregated amounts, that greater disclosure is possible. In fact, Prime Super and Commonwealth Super Corporation are two recent examples. They've both released detailed lists of their expenditure on marketing, sponsorship and directors' fees. It didn't seem too hard for them. It's important we find a balance that puts transparency first. My sense from the recent election and talking to people across the ACT and elsewhere is that Australians want more transparency. They want more transparency across the board, from the way that government is operating to be able to see where their superannuation fees are actually going. I respect Senator McKim and what he's seeking to do in negotiating a solution with the government on this issue, but would point out that in the time that he has taken, superannuation funds have sent out their annual statements, most with an aggregated amount for these various categories, and we're none the wiser where that money is actually going. They've taken advantage of a watered-down transparency measure, which was the first regulation issued by the new Assistant Treasurer. According to the Grattan Institute, in a 2018 study showed that Australians paid more than $30 billion a year in super fees, and almost 2% of Australia's and that equates to almost 2% of Australia's annual gross domestic product. That's much more than the $23 billion we spent on energy in that same year. And a household nearing retirement pays average superannuation fees of $3,700 a year. So these are not trivial amounts. These are things that we should actually be looking at. We should be ensuring that there is transparency, that super fund members can see where their money is going and then can make an informed opinion as to whether that sits well with them. Superannuation is clearly a massive industry with huge power. It's really important we keep that power accountable because people's retirements rely on a well-regulated, high-performing sector. There are so many reform priorities needing attention in this space, from chasing down the hundreds of millions of dollars in unpaid superannuation entitlements to reforms that will stop super being used by wealthy individuals to pay less tax. These reforms should be a priority, not reducing transparency in super fund spending, and I'll be encouraging the government to take it on at the earliest opportunity. As I said earlier, it's been disappointing to see Senator McKim pushing for more transparency, but at the same time putting off actually dealing with this and potentially disallowing a regulation which is reducing transparency after an election that you could say was about integrity and transparency. It's a poor move. Senator McKim asked for 2 weeks to be able to negotiate with Minister Jones and get a good outcome for superannuation members. That 2 weeks has come and gone, and I'm moving this disallowance motion because I believe this is important to Australians. This does matter, and I don't see the downside on having more transparency. The argument about regulatory burden is an absolute furphy. We know that there's already been funds that have used the old regulations. They didn't see it as too burdensome. And so I move this and ask the Senate to debate it and ultimately vote on whether or not we think that less transparency is a good thing.
Thank you, Senator Pocock. Now,